Let me start with a very simple and basic question. How did you get in contact with technology? It is not so, at that times where you started, it is not so obvious to make music with technology demanded a lot.
Oh, wow, that can be answered in a number of ways. The earliest and most foremost probably was that I was the oldest daughter, and therefore, since my father really wanted a son, I was the one who he taught to use all the tools, and he taught me to solder, and he taught me to build a crystal radio, and I had my little science lab in the basement and stuff. Um, and I never felt comfortable with all the stereotypes of what a girl was supposed to do. And, from the late 40s and 1950s, when things were pretty uptight for women, and we were supposed to not look forward to having, yeah, we were supposed to look forward to always having a man around to do all those things. But that didn't really fit me very well. I was very curious about everything. I wanted to try doing everything myself. Um, I had science fair projects and stuff. When when I was asked during high school, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to go into music. They said, this is not possible. Absolutely not possible, because I had not had the childhood full of piano lessons or, the kinds of musical background that most people who go professionally into music have had. I was more or less self-taught, starting with folk instruments, mandolin, which my grandmother played, and then guitar and banjo and stuff. And then I kind of worked through learning notation. And I really loved music best always, but it took me until after I had finished a degree in the social sciences to finally accept that if I didn't give it a real try to go into music, I would regret it for the rest of my life. So I had a lot of catching up to do. And I fortunately happened to be introduced to Morton Subotnick and brought down to his studio over the Bleecker Street Cinema in Greenwich Village. And technology became a way for me to immediately start composing using sounds in the same way a painter does on a painting, on recording tape, as opposed to writing down a set of instructions for someone else to play the music. It gave me time to work hard and catch up and do all the ear training classes and all of the counterpoint studies and all of the background and learning and history and theory that I needed to learn. So I was studying like mad, learning all that stuff at the same time as being able to start composing immediately using technology. And because technology is what you make of it, what you do with it, I was able to find ways of doing music with it. It was only a couple of years after I started working with the Buchla 100 modular synthesizer that I got frustrated with it because it didn't have memory, it didn't have precision. It was a shared studio, so if I made a complicated patch and I had 3 hours booked to work with it, as soon as I left, someone else, maybe Reese Chatham or Eliane Radigue, would come in and take down everything I had done, and I would never be able to get it back to the same. I was lucky to, when Reese Chatham started the music series at the Kitchen, he had invited Max Matthews and Emmanuel Gent to do a concert, and I was also on that series, so I met them, and then it took a while for me to work up the guts to ask Max if I could come out and start using computers, because I wanted the precision, the memory, and the ability to use arbitrarily complex logic and not, you don't have to run out of modules. You can have as many invocations of subroutine as you want. And a subroutine is equivalent maybe to a module in an analog synthesizer. So I was very lucky to be able to get to use Bell Telephone Labs equipment. That's a long answer to a short question.
Yes, I personally was lucky enough to meet Max Matthew in Stanford in 91 to 93. So I was wondering, what was it for you? Because it's a completely different studio in a lab, because I guess there are no synthes, keyboards where you can play on, everything is connected to a speaker. I think it's completely different lab.
Yeah, the Buchla, of course, didn't use a conventional keyboard, and I wasn't a keyboard player anyway. My background really was plucked instruments, and improvising. But yeah, I felt very intimidated initially, and I think I always felt slightly intimidated by Max, even though we were friends, and I stayed at his house when he was at Stanford, and and knew his whole family. But it was still very intimidating. When Max let me in, he told me later he didn't know that I didn't already know how to program a computer. He assumed that I knew that. So I hauled up in this little desk in this little office they gave me and got a book on computer programming and Fortran programming and worked through all of the examples. And then I also kibitzed and sat with and watched experienced programmers program and what they did and what they changed, and learned, and learned enough to do what I wanted to do musically.
Did you see in that time already the potential of using the electronic in an unusual way? Because I think
yes, yes, because you could interact in real time with complex logical processes. You could design a process and interact with it in real time. And this was altogether new. Most people working with computers at that time were working with one of Max's languages, Music 5, or something comparable, which was non-real-time interactive. You would put in all your instructions and the thing would grind away, and then you would come back after the weekend or whatever and take your 30 seconds of audio out of the data buffer and record it to tape, and then you would do that again and splice that on. That's how most people work. But with the groove system, which Max and Dick Moore had designed, it was possible to basically, it was computer-controlled analog synthesis. So there were analog oscillators, analog filters. Max had copied some of Moog's filters designs and come up with some wonderful filters of his own. And it was possible to interact with those in real time because the computer was not doing the synthesis, which at that point was very slow. It was, we're talking a computer that occupied 2 rooms and had 32K of core memory. And the memory was so slow, you could take a core memory card out of that computer, walk down the hall, put it in another computer, and it would still have the data on it. It was just, like an elephant compared to a hummingbird compared to what we have now. But it was extremely exciting. It was just all new stuff. You never knew whether anything would work. Just about everything was being done for the first time. We had long discussions about whether it would ever be possible to do like digital reverb or whether that would be beyond the capabilities of computers forever. And now, of course, there are thousands of reverbs done digitally, thousands of different plugins and pedals and things out there, and everybody does that. But it was a long time ago. That was, we're talking a half century.
When you were working with a computer, you always need to tell it something what it should do. So you need a concept or some idea. So it's not like sitting down at the piano or taking the guitar and improvise. It is, you need a certain planning. Was this the moment where the ideas came, the musical ideas came, or how did you interact with the computer?
Programming is a sort of iterative process, and you start with something very simple. You want to be able to simply make a tone, and then vary it. And you might want to use a computer to gradually open or close a filter, or simulate an envelope generator, which we already had on analog synthesizers. Computers, of course, then were very stupid. They didn't come with any of this stuff built in. They didn't come with all of the stuff they have now. SDKs and APIs for playing notes or interfacing with MIDI and all the stuff that's built into the operating systems at this point. But you were down there actually dealing with the machine. You're talking a control panel with all these little light bulbs, and you entered data in by like pushing buttons and stuff. And we had a punch card reader, and it was like what you would consider at this point, prehistoric technology. But it was still very exciting, and it when something worked, was great. But it's an iterative process. You do something and you get sounds back, and then you immediately know what you're frustrated with, or what else you need to control, what other aspects of the sound you go and you put that in, and then when you listen to the results you're getting, you know that you want to make another set of changes, and you just keep going through that loop of listening to what comes out and then deciding what you want to do with it next, or what is frustrating that you need to change.
Mm-hmm. Was there, beside this logical act of programming, was there as well an aspect of intuition or improvisation as well?
Yes, because of real-time interaction, you could, it was more or less improvisational, but the variables that you chose might not be which pitch am I selecting on a fretboard or a keyboard. The variables you control might be something like a probability, or a cutoff point for the output of a process. A big thing that I learned at Bell Labs was, of course, information theory, because that was where Shannon had been, and John Pierce was there during some of the time that I was there. And so I tended to want to control informational entropy a lot, which is, it's not the same as thermodynamic entropy. It really has to do with the rate at which unpredictable information is, or unexpected information, new information is introduced into a data stream. And so essentially this is a great concept for music, because you have the ability to control music. It's a way to control emotions through giving people what they do expect and what they don't expect, and frustration and satisfaction, and all of the basic emotional stuff that music helps us as human beings deal with. And the rate at which new information reaches us, and when something unexpected versus something repeated or extrapolated happens, these are, the level on which I like to aspire to create variables, as opposed to just pitches or other aspects. And then I could automate some things that, where I knew how I made decisions, I could, I'd like to say that you automate what you can figure out how you decide, and then you do intuitively what you can't figure out how you decide, and you just know, and you reach for it. And the hard part is to figure out which kinds of variables are which things you want to automate. Something like stereo placement, I had a routine that would create stereo balance among another number of voices, because I always wanted things to be roughly balanced left, right, that I could animate. But when to come to the end of a gesture and sound, that's something I would want to do by feel. Whether it's on the level of the density of new events or on the level of just making a filter open and close.
It sounds like it is a very pioneering, very new way of thinking or interacting with music. And I guess there were not many other people you could talk to, or you could role models of how to, what kind of music is being able to be created with these kind of techniques.
Oh, almost everyone I would talk to would say that this was completely dehumanizing for music, that music was all of the soul and all of the body and all of this, and the computers, back then, computers were endowed in the general public's mind with the characteristics of those who owned them, which at that point, before personal computers, were the government, the banks, the insurance companies, the military, all of none of whom you exactly think of as music. So there was a tremendous amount of resistance, I would say. And electronic music still was being resisted. The Musicians Union in New York would not admit synthesizer players at the time because they thought they would take the jobs of all other musicians eventually, that they would put all legitimate musicians who played real instruments out of business. And it was a hard sell. So there was this sense of mission behind validating computers as tools for music and even synthesizers as tools for music.
Would you say you had a mission for yourself, a kind of target you want to reach, or?
It was important to make really good music that people would want to listen to, not just as a novelty, not just as an existence proof or a proof of concept for the fact that you could control sound with computers and make things that were similar to music. It had to be music people wanted to listen to validate the idea that computers were musical instruments and are musical instruments. And eventually now, everyone uses computers for music. I mean, you're crazy not to use computers at some point in your process doing music. So now that mission has been accomplished, and I've been going back to writing for instruments more, for traditional ones, scores for players to play, because there's a human interaction there that I've been missing in the computer music. Even though I do love to be able to work on a piece the way an artist does on a painting, on the work itself, on the final work on which is recorded, because I think I do some of my best work that way. But I also am enjoying writing scores for other people to play at this point. Mission accomplished in terms of validating computers for music.
Yeah, it is interesting that Eliane Radic, you mentioned her before in one comment. She as well does these days more instrumental music. So there is, would you think there is or would you feel there is a parallel development, or do you think your individual development was completely different to hers? I mean, this aspect of
we haven't been that much in touch. We have a warm relationship, but we've never discussed this transition from electronics to instruments. It's something that maybe Eliane and I should talk about. We were friends trying to figure out the Buchla when neither of us had seen a synthesizer before, and we would get together and try this and that. It could be similar thinking, but it also just could be the traditional instruments are wonderful and beautiful, and there's something positive about working with other human beings as opposed to all those lone all-nighters in the studio working with just the equipment.
Yeah, but you did in opposition to Eliane, you worked with digital or with very, very early digital, let's say, music creation. Yeah, Eliane was staying always with a kind of analog, with her analog instrument, her one analog instrument.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I loved what Eliane was doing, which was causing us to become so much more sensitive to the extremely subtle changes in sound and opening up all of our cognitive filters and being able to perceive on a level which had been kind of lost in music that consisted mostly of large numbers of notes. But for me, the structure of music was a more important and interesting thing. And because of it being computer controlled analog initially, and then digital on small, weak, limited computers that had a fraction of the computational capacity of, of my watch even. It was, I focused on a different level. I wanted to focus on the structure because I think of music as structure in a way. I mean, it's sonic experience on one level, but it's also the way you structure that in order to create, which for me is primary, an emotional experience.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important statement. Music or even digital music is an emotional, it deals and interacts with human emotions. Is that something you were missing in other composition of electroacoustic music?
Yeah, there was, I've never really, well, I have at times, but I've tended to avoid like very long pieces or drones. And if you look at the either the popular or the classical or the folk repertoires, most pieces of music are not these like, Steve Reich, Morton Feldman bragging to each other that they each made one. I did a piece that's 2 hours long. Well, I did one that's 3 hours long. That doesn't really do anything for me. I've tended toward shorter, more dramatic forms that have a structure and come to a conclusion much more like all the traditional forms. But once in a while, I've done something that just goes kind of on, and there are processes that just kind of go on forever. The last piece on the concert program being such, an algorithm that takes no human input and goes on generating ongoing music as long as there's electricity, unless I hit the stop button, I mean, literally, theoretically, could go on forever, but hopefully with an interesting enough algorithm that you kind of want to go on listening to it, coming up with new things. I've tended to not want to use repetition so much as extrapolation and evolution. I like things that evolve and go on coming up with new stuff as opposed to well, like the dominant form of our time right now seems to be like people working with loopers, and then you'll put in something and it'll go on repeating, then you'll add another layer over it and another layer over it. That happens all the time. I don't work like that. I've always been like a through composing person, where if I'm doing a score on paper, for example, I will want to move all of the parts forward together, as opposed to old-fashioned cantus firmus technique, where you put in one line and then you put another line over it. And that's just, the way my mind works with music. Maybe coming from a background of improvisation, where you have all of the parts coordinated simultaneously, moving forward together, interlocked.
Mm-hmm. Listening to your music, I thought that these sounds you use and you invented have a very poetic, expressive aspect, and as well as an abstract aspect. I mean, it's not only how should I say, since they were so new, so unusual, they were able to have this strong expression or strong expressivity in them. Were you aware of this, or do you think this was an effect of later perception of these pieces?
It's like a minimum standard. I mean, it's music. It has to be expressive. It has to. I mean, all the things that we love about the music that inspired us to go into music in the first place, those are the things that, you know, if I can't reach the level where it has that kind of feeling, and can capture and hold attention, then, you know, I have failed, and it goes on the junk heap. So the thing is to do lots and lots and lots of composing and throw out everything except the ones that kind of work out.
And you have this, you mentioned both elements, the emotional reaction as well as the algorithmic structuring, the context given by the logic aspect of the algorithm, of evolution of an algorithm, for example. This is a technique to compose, which later on you find, very much later on you find as well with instrumental composers who use algorithmic structures as material generators for their instruments.
Yeah, you know, it seems to be fairly easy these days, given the proliferation of languages, PD and Max being the best known probably, for that permit you to produce music like, what should we call them? Well, series is processes that generate ongoing series of musical material, but a musical composition that has meaning and reaches you internally and makes you feel emotions it's the structural aspects that are important, and live interaction is a good way to do those. But you also, you know, it's sort of like an ultimate thing to figure out how to get the computer to keep coming up with stuff that will arouse emotions. But still, you know, if you generate a texture, I want to have it have enough variables that I can make it, that I can impose a structure on it that gives some kind of dramatic experience. I think maybe that would be the way to describe that. It's hard to describe that, you know, music is always hard to describe and talk about in words.
So in this case, if you think of, isn't Music Mouse the program you developed, isn't that an incorporation of all your ideas, or do you think it is one?
One particular range of ideas. I had been working for several years on different technological systems. There was the Groove system, then there was the HAL Alice system, then I worked with the Apple II for a while, and we did the Alpha Centauri, and then the Maclavier, which in Canada. And I always had been trying to do a general purpose system in which any musician could configure to do their personal kind of music. And then I had kind of had it with general systems and decided to make a small, dedicated, single purpose instrument that was fixed in many ways and limited and just did one thing well, and was an instrument, a specific instrument, rather than a general purpose system in which other people could define instruments and ways of working for themselves. So that, yeah, lots of controls. And again, you know, on the levels of musical parameters, such as superimposing lines that could be parallel or contrary motion, or, you know, changing modes and keys, and, you know, all of these things. And then also a bunch of timbral controls, because it's a two-handed instrument, Music Mouse, with moving the mouse on one hand, but controlling an entire keyboard full of options for how that gesture is interpreted and rendered into sound with the other hand. So it turned into a fairly complex instrument eventually, again, with that sort of iterative process of what is, when you work with it, what is it that's frustrating? What is it that you want to do that you can't do? And you always find something and keep going. And I have versions of it that were never released, that were, just kind of at the end of its life cycle when Apple went to a Unix-based Mac OS X system, and the whole code base became obsolete. So, I mean, it's been kind of on my to-do list eventually to revive Little Mousy. But things are always just so too busy, and they keep changing everything out from under you. In computer evolution, things just keep changing way too fast. I mean, I remember the days when you could spend your entire life learning a single instrument and attaining a level of deep mastery that at this point people no longer experience, because they're working with constantly evolving technology. You learn how to use this a little, and then that a little, and then this comes out, and you just starting to really get into it when this thing, which is completely different from spending your entire life attaining the deepest mastery and knowledge of a single way of doing music, which was true up until the period in which I've been composing. And I do sort of miss that ability to focus on one thing. I'm a person who's very good at focusing on one thing, never was very good at multitasking.
We talked about the new technology, the newest technology, the let's say the fantasy you had to create to work with this and make music out of it. But if you think back, was it harder for you as a woman to be in this field of technological music, or did you not care, or what was your experience about this topic?
Yeah, I personally really didn't care or pay much attention to the gender issues, at least initially. I just was in love with doing it and working on it and with music. And I already had enough strikes against me for going into music relatively late in life, after doing a degree in something else and then deciding that I just couldn't bear not to do music. It's kind of odd. Yeah, I was always very aware of the stereotypes placed on us as women, as girls, and the expectations. And I think from a very early age was certain that I just wasn't going to let those apply to me. I mean, just looking at my parents' relationship, my mother was a brilliant woman who could have done just about anything, and ended up kind of like being the servant of my father and her children all her life. And I just wasn't going to let that happen to me. But it really didn't matter that much. I never needed a role model. People talk about role models. You don't need the example of someone who's demographically in your category doing something. You need to just be in love with doing and love the process of doing it. And that's what matters. You're in there, you're doing it, you're making it, and you're totally involved in that process. And what anybody thinks about it is really just irrelevant. I do have to add, though, that I think I was exceptionally lucky that Max Matthews, who had more women in his department under his directorship than just about any other part of the lab, let me use their facilities, because I don't think I would have been able to get into any of the very few computer music studios that were academically based in this country. I'm not sure any women at that point were doing computer music, and it was, again, very much stereotyped as a male thing, which is ironic because initially the first computer programmers were women because it was initially viewed more as a clerical thing for the data entry. Back in the early days in the 50s, there were a lot of women doing programming. But once it became computer science and you could get a degree in that, suddenly it became a field of engineering and it became a male field. And things really changed when that happened.
Yeah, and you described there's this situation already that in many studios there was a gatekeeper who said who is allowed to use the studios, and there was no alternative. There was no home computer which was available.
Right, and you have to remember at that point that women composing was still a new thing for many people. When I started composing, I was not aware that any other woman had ever done it. I know there have been many, at this point, but back then I didn't. But that didn't matter. I mean, what mattered to me was that I had musical ideas and I wanted to write them down so that I wouldn't forget them. I mean, it was just something I wanted to do, and it had nothing to do with what other people were doing or what other people would think of it. It just was something that I personally, I would come upon musical ideas when improvising, and I'd want to write them down so I wouldn't forget them. And then at one point, a roommate came up behind me and he said, they call that composing. And I said, no, I'm not composing. I'm just trying to write some things down so I don't forget them, But because the concept of a composer was one that I even thought of as, it's a bunch of old, dead white European men, But it's the being and doing that's primary for me. And the concept of what other people think is really something you have to put that aside and just not think about it. And when you're sufficiently involved in the process of doing and loving what you do, it's easy to put that aside. It really doesn't matter what anybody thinks. All that matters is, can you find the time to do it and the means to do it?
So I guess you were not aware that you were a pioneer, or you were pioneering new paths of music creation.
I was trying to find ways of doing music that I could do while I in the background was learning theory, counterpoint, harmony, history, and all of that other stuff that I hadn't had as a child. I mean, it was like a shortcut.
Yeah.
Because I was working directly with sounds and with logic, and logic is logical, and math is clear and wonderful, and those were good workable tools that, for some reason, were just by stroke of luck coming to the point where they were becoming useful for music at a point when I needed them and could offer something in terms of helping them evolve.
And since you work so long in this field of music, what do you do today? Is there still something to do? Is there still something new to find for you?
There's always something to do. Yes, of course. I mean, it's just unfortunate that we each have a limited lifespan, because I would love to be around in 100 years to see what's happening in music then. Yeah, I mean, I've worked on and off with a company called Eventide here that do wonderful things, and I've been pretty involved with them the past couple of years in terms of music tech. And of course, I'm still composing, and I mean, pain in the neck, but worth doing. I have any number of unfinished projects and pieces and things from over the years to finish up, a lot of which were instrumental works that nobody was interested in for a very long time. People came to me for music because they wanted something electronic or computer-based. So I have a lot of not quite, but almost finished instrumental scores, and then a few that I have actually finished up. But I want to get back to a lot of those projects and finish them up. And same with some computer-based stuff. At the start of the COVID thing, when everybody holed up and secluded themselves, I had this desire to go back to what it felt like when I was in my teens, and I would take my guitar out in the back porch and just pour my emotions out on it. And it was very direct and very low tech, and just kind of see which direction I might have taken otherwise if I'd not gone into electronics, and where my music would go if I just let it unfold in a different way. So at the start of the pandemic, the first thing I found myself doing was starting a string quartet, which I still have to go back and finish, which is all canonical forms. I mean, I still am really big on structure. It's one of the reasons that I totally love Bach. All the amazing structural work that he did, at the same time as never compromising the emotional content or the intensity that, your mind does not wander when you're listening to Bach. Whatever he did, I'm fascinated with it anyway. So I've been writing canons and pieces. Spiegel means mirror as well, being in Germany. So I've been writing pieces with inversions and canons and inversions and retrogrades and mirror-shaped things. But they all have to meet the same thing as the computer music. That they have to have an emotional validity and a dramatic form and a moment-to-moment. You don't want you follow them. Your mind doesn't wander. They just, and it's it's a high standard, but I have high standards for my music, and I reject a lot of it. A lot of things don't work out, and the same with computer programming. A lot of things don't work out.
Thank you very much for this interview. It was a very short, condensed journey to a life which is now like from the beginnings of the digital era of computer music to the situation today. Thank you very much, Laurie Spiegel.
Oh, thank you very much, Ludi, for good questions and an interesting interview.